Cool, so just to get in there first, Christos was going to talk about the Kanye West game that just got announced. And I mean, I'm going to let you finish, but I just wanted to mention it first. I hope that was on video, because holy shit, that was good. So there's some burn ointment on that table, just grab some on the way. No, so yeah, Christos is going to do another musically. I'm really annoyed because everyone's gone, like, David brought out every ballad he could, Christos has gone for like a love song title. Everyone knows that the only really romantic song is Hadaway's What Is Love, and no one has mentioned it. So if anyone that hasn't spoken yet has that in their presentation, I'll give you VideoBrains. But if you don't, I'm all very disappointed. So yeah, Christos will say some words. Hello.
He stole the fucking Kanye announcement. And someone's done song titles. Jokes are all I've got, man. So yeah, no, I think it's amazing that Kanye West is making a fucking personal game. That's just something I never thought I would say. I think that's amazing. Someone actually said they wanted to play it on Yeezy difficulty, which I thought was the best response. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you about Grim Fandango, because to me Grim Fandango is arguably the most interesting and best love story that I've ever experienced in video games. Not because it is flawless and dramatic and uplifting and all of that stuff, but because it is difficult and hard and upsetting and things like that. So I wanted to kind of delve into a bit and talk to you a bit about why I think it's so important that love stories like the one in Grim Fandango exist and continue to exist. So love for me is a lot about sacrifice. Love for me is about leaving your house at 3 in the morning on a work night to travel to see somebody else just so you can be there in person. Love is saving up for a very, very long time so you can give someone the best possible day ever so they'll always have a good memory to go back to. Love is a lot of things. Another thing love is, in addition to normal sacrifice, is some people would say that it's self-destructive. The interesting thing about love and the interesting thing about making sacrifices is there are a lot of narratives in which people take the concept of love and then they take it slightly too far. How far do you go for the person you love? What happens when doing everything you can for that person starts to hurt you in turn? At what point do you pull out? At what point do you pull back? Love is also about safety. Love is amazing because to be loved by another human being, whether romantically or whether, remember, you're a family or a friend or otherwise, or the way I feel about puns, love is safe. It feels incredible to be around somebody who will not abandon you for your failings, who will accept you for who you are, who will always be around, who is committed to you in the most intimate possible way, who accepts that a small part of the universe rotates around you constantly. That's pretty amazing. But powerful love, interesting love, video games and writing in general, is about the abandonment of that safety. About knowing that you would be willing to walk through fire for somebody else, about willing to take the bullets, about how far you would be willing to go. So I wanted to talk to you about this feeling, which is love is, and I'm going to read this out, holy shit, this is amazing, am I really here? Is this happening? Is this what life is? This is what life is. This is what life has to be forever now, no matter the cost. And that's why I like the concept of love, because it is such that pure rush of emotion that it's quite hard to stop typing stuff like that when you start thinking about it. This is Manny Calavera. I love this man. I think he's one of the greatest video game characters ever conceived. The interesting thing about Manny Calavera is, if you've ever done any reading into Grim Fandango, you know there's a lot of history behind it. It's very centered around the Day of the Dead. There's a lot of symbolism, of course. Manny's name has cultural roots. Obviously, Manny, Manuel, and Calavera. Calavera actually represents skulls, or also specifically the sugar skulls that are used in the Day of the Dead, and etc., etc., etc. There's another interpretation of his first and second name, which I prefer for the context of this talk. The reason that Manny is so interesting is that he's an arsehole. He's just terrible in every conceivable way, because we are introduced to a character who immediately we know to be not a good person, because the reason that he works the job that he works in the land of the dead is because he did something absolutely terrible before he died. So he's already an anti-hero. In fact, he's just pretty much an outright villain. But we're never sure how to feel about him, but we empathize because Manny is us. Manny is someone who is stuck in a job that he doesn't feel completely secure about all times, who wants more for himself than what he can seemingly grasp, and who is desperate just to find something exciting to happen to him. In the Grim Fandango design document, Manny is described as travel agent of the dead, desperate for a good soul. And that's it. That encapsulates him entirely in that document. It's a very simple description, but it makes me wonder, because desperate for a good soul could mean multiple things. Desperate for a good soul in the context of Manny's job. Manny is a travel agent for people that have just died. That sounds fucking weird. Bear with me. When you die, you are presented to a travel agent. Depending on the life you have lived, you will either be given a very amazing reward for being really nice while you're alive, which is a ticket on a number 9 train. A number 9 train is a 4-minute journey that takes you through the underworld and into the final afterlife, so you can be at peace and so you can rest. And that sounds pretty fucking great. However, if you've led an absolutely terrible life, you're given a walking stick with a compass on it, and you have to travel through the land of the dead, which takes 4 years. And the risk there is that if you die on that journey, if your skeletal body is destroyed, you're gone forever, which is terrifying and important, because otherwise there's no motivation for any narratives like this. The most difficult thing they did from a writing perspective with Grim Fandango is they created a universe in which you've got to create the concept of threat and want and stress in a world where people have already had the most valuable thing that they own taken from them, which is life. It's an incredibly powerful motivator in writing, because fundamentally, most characters tend not to want to die. There is that survival instinct in most characters. So it's interesting to play around with that. Except Manny's desperation for a soul is not quite the same as it's described in the design document, because it becomes more than that. Manny is, like I've said before, an arsehole and doesn't care, and all he wants is good clients, because the better clients he gets, the sooner he gets to finish, and the sooner he gets to go to the afterlife, and the sooner he can live this life behind. So why would he sacrifice anything for it whatsoever? I mean, so I'm going to be upfront with you very briefly. I think the puzzle design in most popular adventure games is horrendous. I can't stand it. I love Ron Gilbert and Tim Schafer, but quite frankly, if you're asking me to solve a complex puzzle by attaching a pulley to a rubber chicken, you can fuck off. But it's interesting to think about the concept of survival instinct, because Manny's life is so easy before all of this. It's miserable, but it's straightforward. He has an objective. His objective is to leave. His objective is to get to the afterlife, and that's really important. But then there's the emotional truth. Manny meets Mercedes Colomar, also known as Meche. She comes in as a client that he's not supposed to get, a client he committed fraud to get, so he could leave his job earlier. Except in the middle of the appointment, when he leaves the room briefly, she runs away, and she runs away into the land of the dead. And she's just another client. she's not particularly important. I mean, he could effectively wait. It's interesting that we've defined him so quickly as terrible, and then we're expected to wait for him to do something about it. But the thing with Manny is that he shifts in that moment, and it's very, very interesting, because he is, in essence, a character that has a very, very straightforward existence, who doesn't need to complete any puzzles, who doesn't need to do anything overly difficult. He could stay in that one place forever. He doesn't need to spend 4 years chasing someone who, whenever he sees them, rejects him repeatedly because she thinks he's an idiot. And quite rightly is probably also wondering how he keeps popping up everywhere she goes over the course of 4 years, which is quite a justifiable concern, in my opinion. So ignoring that slightly creepy subtext for the purpose of this talk, yeah, he could stay in his office forever, and this would be the timeline of the video game. It's not very interesting, is it, really? You just come to work, he'd get a client, he'd leave, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that at all. He does this. He leaves his work, he travels across the land of the dead, he starts up a business. And what's fascinating about Manny as a character is fundamentally he's constantly corrupted by the fact that he's selfish. His journey stops for an entire year at one point because he starts working at a cafe, and soon enough he's turned it into a casino a year later, and he runs the casino. He has an absolutely fantastic life. His demon best friend Glottis is enjoying himself immensely as the pianist, which is, if you've never played this game seriously, it's a giant demon playing a tiny piano. Like, please. But it's interesting because he comes downstairs and he sees Glottis and he says, hey, we've been on this journey, we've completed all these puzzles. This is his happy ending. He could stay there, he could earn the money, you could complete the puzzles in Rubikava, the city in which the casino exists. But he doesn't do that. He says to Glottis, well, we've got to do the right thing. What about Meche? What about the stability? And this is the interesting thing about romance in video games, is it's so convenient most of the time. In Uncharted, the love interests tend to be someone he just meets on the way while murdering thousands of foreign people in order to steal treasure, because he's been trained to do that since birth and has an incredible resilience against post-traumatic stress disorder. But that aside, Super Mario is kind of similar. I mean, it sucks. It's the worst plot in video games. But it's simple. He has a love interest. She's in a castle. He runs right. He gets the love interest. There is no massive mansion halfway through the 8th world of Super Mario Brothers where he could rest forever. The idea is, in video game design at the moment, for the most part, seemingly, that romance is just something that either happens along the way or is the reward. It's never part of the journey, and the interesting thing about Grim Fandango is that it is very, very importantly part of that journey. It transforms Manny. Manny is the only character in video games I've ever seen go through full-on denial, which was really interesting because he does what I used to do and what I still do when I don't want to admit that I fancy someone. Which is, he'll say, oh no, I'm not interested in that person. It's fine. It's all, it's straightforward, it's fine, it's a platonic relationship, everything is fine. And then there'll be a beat of silence and he'll be like, but we can't stay here, right? Like, we've got to maybe just see how they're doing. And it's interesting watching him go through that, because the reason I love it so much is because it represents real relationships to me. Real relationships are not easy, they are not straightforward, they involve sacrifice, they often involve doing lots of things that you don't want to do. They often involve getting dumped, breaking up, getting back together, moving around, figuring out whether or not you want to uproot your entire life to go and live with somebody else, and is that worth it? Is it worth putting yourself in a scary, unsafe, unfamiliar environment just for the sake of somebody else? Manny does that, and that's quite interesting, because the main thing it affects is his day-to-day life. But what he's risking is everything. He's literally risking his life every second that he doesn't spend in that office, and he never questions it. And by doing so, saves a whole bunch of other people. And I think that's interesting, because fundamentally the puzzles in Grim Fandango never really reflect much on what's going on. Puzzles in point-and-click adventure games and adventure games in general, in my opinion, are often things of convenience. They're often oddly tied together and make no fucking sense whatsoever, and I'll be the first to admit that. But it's interesting that some of the puzzles that Manny engages in seem to have absolutely nothing to do with his overall objective, the objective you're given at the start, which is to leave and to reach the afterlife. Some of them are confronting a giant crocodile in the middle of the sewer, which is, if I'm honest, I'm not really too fussed about how attractive you are. I'm not going to face off against a giant crocodile, so more power to him. But it's interesting that he does that simply because it's complete derailing. He never needs to do any of these things, and he's actually making the game more inconvenient for the player because he can't quite seem to cope with how he feels about another human being, and I think that's kind of cool. The thing about the journey in Grim Fandango that makes me so happy and so entertained is that it's an underworld full of people that are constantly falling in and out of love. Most of the characters you meet are in love with something, and it's actually quite frequently unrequited, and it's painful, and it's hard, and you can't do anything for these people to solve it. In fact, every time Manny gets involved in someone else's relationship, it actually gets worse. So he is effectively maintaining the arsehole position quite strongly there, I'll admit, but it's interesting to me that love in video games doesn't have to be this simple, and that love can be hard and can be painful, and it makes me wonder why we're not playing around with this idea more in games design and writing, and why love is always so simple, because it shouldn't have to be. It seems so weird that we have difficulty settings for everything, from dialogue exchanges to combat, to the speed at which the cars go in Mario Kart. But the one difficulty we never seem to think about is the one that seems to crop up in almost every mainstream narrative ever. Because everyone's got to have a love interest, right? And it's always got to be resolved. One of my favourite things about LA Noire... Hold on. How old is that game? Am I going to be spoiling this? The one thing about LA Noire is that it has a bad ending, and then it finishes. The thing about LA Noire is that the villains win completely and the protagonist dies. And then the credits roll and there's nothing else. It's not Red Dead Redemption. There's no shitty epilogue. It's just over and that's it. And it's interesting that it frustrates me that it's so infrequent that video game writers are willing to take that leap. They're willing to stand up and go, no, you know what, life isn't this easy and life isn't this straightforward, and everyone is frustrated and sad and has their own completely justified reasons for it. And Grim Fandango is a game about that. Grim Fandango is a game about going on a 4-year journey, but it's also a 4-year journey of self-improvement. How often do you see that? The thing about video games, especially serialized video games, is they rely on the sitcom concept of equilibrium, where everything is restored and everything is fine at the end of each episode. It's not Game of fucking Thrones. You're not rolling a dice to find out who's going to be alive at the end of every episode. I think that's the only entertainment concept that ever destroyed my innocence more than Dark Souls. But yeah, the interesting thing about these 4 years is you only spend one day in each of these 4 years. Between those years, you see such a sea change in him. He becomes the captain of a ship. He becomes the person that runs a casino. He travels across a massive wasteland. And he always seems to return to a point where his objective is back to get to the afterlife. And yet, every single time you rejoin him, within a few scenes it comes back, and he can't stop thinking about her and the sacrifices he has to make. And I think that's quite interesting, because to me, being in love with someone is to stop thinking about everything else for a moment and have your mind move to them as the default topic. And I think it's pretty incredible that somebody did that. And journeys like these are important, because this is what love is made of. Here's a pun. Thank you very much.